Let's get started. Welcome to General Assembly, everybody. Yeah! All right. We got a big night. So has everyone here heard of General Assembly before? Raise a hand who's been here before. All right. Any veterans in the audience tonight? There we go. All right. I'll hand mine up too as blood. All right. Thank you for your service. Okay, so let's talk about tonight. So my name is Scott Kirkpatrick. I am the President and Chief Operating Officer of General Assembly. General Assembly, what we do is we empower individuals to pursue the work they love. And we do that by teaching the most relevant skills in the areas of technology, design, data, and business all around the globe. We're in 14 locations globally, and we actually partner with some of the largest corporations with the focus of actually closing that pretty large gap between education and employment, and actually really helping folks rethink human capital. And we do this through innovation, by focusing on return on investment of education, by focusing on inspiration, by focusing on relevant skills, and focusing on our community. And I can tell you, I am personally and professionally so honored tonight to have one of the greatest innovators of our time sitting next to me, and that is General Stanley McChrystal. So welcome him. Thank you. Thank you, sir. So let me explain how the evening will go. We were going to start with a quick bio of the General, and then I will ask some questions to the General, and then we actually have a ton of people live streaming in, so we'll take some questions, not only from the folks online, but also from the audience here. So, General McChrystal, retired 4-star U.S. Army general. He was in command of the International Security Assistance Force Afghanistan and the Joint Special Operations Command. He is now the co-founder of the McChrystal Group and is actually a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute on Global Affairs. And he actually teaches as well. So, you know, for us as education folks, we love having a teacher in our presence. He teaches in leadership and operation. He is also the chairman of the Aspen Institute's Franklin Project that focuses on national service. And he has written 2 New York Times bestsellers. One we're going to talk about tonight, Team of Teams, which is one of my personal favorite business books. So welcome, sir. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
So I'm going to start off. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to start off with your motivation. Most amazing military leaders write about their military experience. You decided to take all that experience and write a business book. Yeah. Tell us about what that motivation was about.
Yeah. Like you, I started in the military, and the military is a great thing, but it's a big bureaucracy at the end of the day. And you learn how to operate in a big bureaucracy, and you learn the good and bad things about that. I still fold my underwear in my drawer, and I guess that's a good thing.
So do I.
But you do learn process, and you learn discipline, but at the same time, that can actually constrain your thinking a bit. We got into Iraq in 2003. I took over a command I'd grown up in, but now I'm the commanding general in the fall of 2003 in Iraq. And regardless of what anybody thinks about the decision to invade Iraq, that wasn't our decision to make. 6 months into it, what looked like it was going to be easy was becoming very, very hard. And what we found was the force that was there, the American force, to include my Special Operations Task Force, was doing things as we had been taught to do and doing them very well, but it wasn't producing the outcome everybody expected it to. So we're in that contradiction where you're doing really well and things are getting much worse. And so what I found myself in 5 years of command in that organization was the need to be a part of changing it completely, changing how we did things, the very culture, my role, and it really sort of set itself in my head as an experience that seemed that it wasn't unique to just military or just war or just that war. Yes. I actually thought it was probably a universal thing that other organizations were running into. So I've been studying it ever since, and I've come absolutely to that conclusion.
Excellent. Well, I love your book, and if you think about our audience today, we have a mix of some senior executives in companies. We also have a number of young professionals early in their career, and I'd like to ask a couple questions directed to that.
Absolutely.
let's start with leadership. And a part of the book that I loved was the story of the chess master to the gardener, and this need to be a leader being an empathetic creator of culture. Can you tell the audience about this, your concept of being a gardener as a leader? Because I think a lot will resonate with folks.
Sure, I really backed into this. If you think about it, my father was a soldier, my father's father was a soldier, my 4 brothers were soldiers, my sister married a soldier, I married the daughter of a soldier, her 3 brothers are soldiers, her sister's the widow of a soldier that I knew. So, I mean, you could get it.
A lot of chess.
Yeah, exactly. So in the military, you've got a heroic view of leadership, and that is, as you come up in the ranks, you are to be the strong person who's got the answers, the general on the battlefield, maneuvering forces around, has got the better strategy. It's a little bit like being a chess master, because if you think of chess, it's a strategy game, came out of India in the 6th century, 64 squares on the board, 2 opponents, and each has 16 pieces with exactly the same capabilities. So the reality is, if you're better than the person across the board from you, you should win. And you control the move of all 16 pieces, and each piece has certain ways it can do, but you control each one of them, sort of like a puppet master controls marionettes. And I went into the war in Iraq thinking I was going to be a better chess master than my opponent, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, but the reality is I started to move, then he moved, then I moved, then he moves, then I'm thinking about my next move, then he moves again, then he moves again, and I go, wait a minute, that's not fair. And then I am reminded in war, there are no rules. And so suddenly, what I found was, instead of being across from one individual who was controlling 16 pieces, really what Al-Qaeda in Iraq had become, I think unconsciously, is all the 16 pieces communicated between each other in real time, and they had the authority to act autonomously. So now, one person trying to control 16 is looking at this networked group of people who can all act fluidly and agilely, and you go, wait a minute, how can one person beat 16? Well, what if it's 1,600 or 16,000? And the reality is you can't. And yet, this is in a time when we now have more communications technology than ever. I used to be able to sit in my operations center and watch Predator downlink, full motion video of every operation we were doing, whether it was Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever. We were in 27 countries. So I could sit there and I could watch in real time like you'd watch a TV show, and I could see individuals moving around. And if you wanted to, you could reach out and talk to them. And so suddenly you're in a period where you've got this intersection of information technology that now allows us to reach everybody all the time and know everything, and that's very seductive. If you are a micromanager at heart, you have finally hit your age, because you can make every decision, you can get everything, but the reality is that's deception, because that's the path to failure, because just at the time when you have all this technology, things have sped up and the complexity is such, there's no way you can chase it fast enough. And so reluctantly, and I will tell you, I didn't come out with this sudden epiphany and do this, we were failing, losing the war, and I realized that if we were going to do this, I was going to have to cut free. I was approving every operation. I was going to have to cut free, push down information and authority. You can't just give authority to act. You have to give information so they have contextual understanding. Push it down and let the organization operate. And so I came to the conclusion that really a better analogy for the kind of leadership I had to do was like a gardener. And a gardener doesn't sound very heroic. But the reality is, you ask somebody what a gardener does, and they say, well, they grow flowers, or they grow vegetables, or they grow fruit. And my response is, that's not true. A gardener grows nothing. Plants grow that stuff. Only plants can do it. But gardeners aren't unimportant. Gardeners prepare the environment. They prepare the soil, they provide the seed, they provide fertilizer, maybe water, all the things of weeding and harvesting that are important to make it work, to create that environment so the plants can do what they do naturally so well, and you can scale it. But it's a step away from being the person who makes the heroic decision to attack or defend and whatnot. So I think it's utterly critical for today's environment, but it's counterintuitive. It's not the obvious solution.
So a lot of the young folks here who have don't work for a lot of gardeners, work from some chess masters, and your concept of empowered execution is critical to guiding a company forward. Yeah. What advice would you give those folks who are trying to move up in their career, who in companies that maybe don't have that culture? How are they going to operate to maybe even get their culture to move in that direction?
Yeah, as John Belushi would say, drink heavily. Yeah, I mean, the reality is, why don't people do that? Yeah. One is because a heroic leader grows up and they think this is the best way to control. That might be one thing. Another thing is the risk. You say, if I don't control it, young people might make mistakes because they're young. And the reality is, you'll make a lot fewer mistakes having someone closer to the problem making the decision than you will someone up the level, but it doesn't feel that way sometimes.
Yes.
And so I think the first thing you have to do, and this is hard. People always ask me, how do you change an organization from lower in it? Because it's hard. You've got to try to propagate up to people, hey, let us go, give us a little space, let us breathe here and we can operate. I think you have to make the case, but ultimately it's got to get up to senior leaders who sometimes are risk averse to the point where it's hard for them to let go.
Yes.
And there's also one other thing, when someone gets into a CEO position or a senior position, they feel like they ought to make decisions or they're not doing their job.
Right.
When I started in the fight in Iraq in the fall of 2003, I was approving every operation, and we were doing about 4 a month, 1 a week. By 2 years later, we were doing 300 a month, and I'm approving none. Now, the problem is you've got to get over the fact that you're not approving operations, because the question would be, well, why do we pay you? Why are you here? And the reality is because you got to step away. What you're really doing is empowering other people, young people, to make the decisions.
That's great. So let me bring up a topic that I think is everyone in this room and on their devices would say they have. We all go to a lot of meetings, all right? A lot of meetings. In fact, we know at General Assembly there's a lot of meetings. And there's a lot of questions. Do we go to too many meetings? How long are meetings? There's people say, hey, we shouldn't be doing as many meetings. You had a totally different tact on your O&I meetings. And these were meetings with 7,000 people, an hour and a half long every day. Talk to us about how you think about meetings and how the lessons there can be taken into the workforce.
Yeah, and you have to think about meetings, what you're trying to do and the value. In the Army, if anybody's ever been here, there's something called passing out the poop. And on a Friday afternoon, I started in the paratroops and I was a lieutenant. And the Friday afternoon, what would happen is the sergeant major would go up to battalion headquarters. The company first sergeant would go up to the battalion headquarters and get the poop from the battalion sergeant major. And he would come back after about an hour meeting and he'd have a line of notes, and he would get the platoon sergeants, the next level down in, and they'd meet for about an hour. And everybody now is sitting around waiting to go home. All the paratroopers sitting around, they probably finished all their work, finished cleaning weapons, they're waiting. And he gets the platoon sergeants, and they meet for about 45 minutes. And then the platoon sergeants all walk out with the poop, and they get the squad leaders. By now, the privates are sitting around, and their wives are already waiting outside the barracks, waiting to drive them home, and that sort of thing. And the squad leaders get the poop. And then they walk out, and they get the privates, and they go, nothing important, go home. And they could have gone home 3.5 hours earlier. And, I learned to hate meetings, but it's what you're trying to do. So in Iraq, what we did was we were spread all over the place, 76 different locations, little bases, some place with one person and some place with hundreds of people. And you're trying to get the information. We started with this video teleconference. I'm a huge believer in video as opposed to calls or anything else, because you can see somebody. So we were doing this daily video teleconference back at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and outside Baghdad, where I was. And we're talking every day for about 30 minutes, and then we're propagating the information down through. But what we found is the speed at which that war operated, the idea that we're going to propagate that information was a little like the poop that I described to you. It never got down, and by the time it got down, if it did, it was distorted and really late to need. And then the idea that you couldn't get information back up. And so our point-to-point between headquarters really was kind of irrelevant. And people down lower are not getting much out of it. So we said, what do we do? Because this is going so fast now and it's so complex. So we just said, we'll just open it up to everybody. And in 76 locations, we had to buy a lot of equipment and get a lot of bandwidth to connect 76 locations video teleconference. Some places were pretty rudimentary, some places were more so. And we connected everybody, and you thought at first we would have chaos.
Right.
But what we did was every day, and the meeting was supposed to be 60 minutes and it grew to 90 minutes, it became the go-to thing. You went to that, and every day for 90 minutes, if you attended that, you knew what was going on. For the next 22 and a half hours of the day, you could operate without asking permission, without asking guidance, because you got the deal. It's like going to the huddle with a quarterback, and you got everything, and you're good to go. And it was also a great democratization of information, because a number of things changed. Before, you've got 3 or 4 levels of the chain of command above you, and the information you get has made its way down through that with the predictable effects. Now everybody's getting the information the same time. Clear water, go to the head of the stream. So now you're seeing everybody starts with a clear picture, a common, what we call shared consciousness, view of it. We didn't make decisions in that meeting. We didn't change the chain of command. People still responsible. But now everybody had this understanding, so it saved a tremendous amount of time and effort. The other thing it did was it showed everybody the big picture. You know, the great story, I love that story about the guy walking down the road and he runs into 2 people who have chisels and hammers and they're knocking on rocks. And he asks the first person, he goes, "What are you doing?" The guy goes, "I'm cutting this rock." And he turns to the other person and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm part of a team building a cathedral."
Right.
And that's what we were doing. Everybody had to see the cathedral every day. And there was a different level of ownership from it and a different level of information across. We developed relationships across the organization that before were siloed. People you didn't know, SEALs got to know Rangers, got to know Delta Force. I mean, people got to know across the organization they wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to.
And how did you, and maybe it applies more to corporations, a lot of times when you have such a high profile meeting, everyone just spends their time preparing for the meeting.
Yeah.
How did you prevent, I want to impress the general.
Yeah.
How did you keep, we're actually getting real things done versus actually just preparation and actually trying to impress you?
Yeah, it takes work and to develop a culture of that. The first is we're doing it every day and we're at war, so there's not a lot of time for foolishness. But the reality is it was a conversation.
Yes.
And so information was passed, but in that 90 minutes, there was probably 1/3 of that was somebody passing information. The rest of it was somebody asking questions about it or making comments. And we specifically designed it that way. So someone would brief and say, "Here's a headline of this, what's going on here." And somebody would immediately go, "Okay, explain that to me," or "How does that link to so-and-so?" And we ran 15 chat rooms parallel to it at the same time. So if you heard somebody brief something, you wouldn't necessarily interrupt the whole thing. You just say, "I need to go see you after this. Can I call you? Can I come see you? Can I do so-and-so?" So that you're getting best practices. The enemy comes out with a new improvised explosive device technology. You got to find that right away. Say, "I want to send my expert to you tomorrow," that sort of thing. And so it's creating that sinew. The communication in the meeting was important, but it opened up the arteries that flowed information laterally across the command in ways we never had before.
So the communication was happening. The organization was set up to actually encourage collaboration. How do you think about that, a scalable team of teams to this concept of individual accountability incentives?
Yeah.
One neck to choke and, I need my incentive for what I do. How do you balance those two concepts?
Yeah, and it's harder in the civilian world, particularly in the civilian world where you have money as a compensation.
Yes.
In the military, it's easy because everybody gets what Congress says they're going to get, everybody knows what everybody gets, and you can never change that, and so it's just off the table. Now, people still want to win they want to get credit, and organizations want to get credit for stuff, so don't say that it's not present, but it's just different. I think what you got to do is balance it. I'm a great believer that how you reward the organization has to be based not on your batting average, but on whether the team wins the game and whether the team goes to the pennant. And so you've got to recognize positive contributions. There's no doubt about it, because some people contribute more than others. They need to be moved up. But you need to keep bringing back everybody to the overall effect. And so what we try to do, and one of the great things about the big forum, is you can constantly bring people back to that.
Yes.
When people just in their row and they're hoeing away, it's easy to start to see the world just in your view, and you start to wonder, why don't I have more resources? In our case, the tough resources were predators and helicopters. Those were the two things every force needed more of. And you think, well, I'm not getting as many predators or helicopters as we need to do our part. But when you see the whole battle across all this area we're fighting, suddenly you go, well, I'm not getting it. I see why.
Yes.
They need it more. And you started having people trading and passing resources between them because people could see where the problems were.
Yes.
And opportunities were. And it created a much broader contextual maturity, I'd say.
Excellent. Well, I want to switch gears to something that you care deeply about, we care deeply about, and that's higher education. You've been quoted numerous times as saying one of our biggest threats to national security is education. Yeah. You know, General Assembly and a lot of folks here, our passion is to close that gap between education and employment and really rethink higher education. I would love to get your thoughts on and some of the learnings that you've had about how can that be applied to actually fixing higher education.
Yeah, and of course you know the problem, and the fact that we're in a globalized world, we're competing with people that we weren't competing with before. And just internal to our own society, a better educated society is going to do better things. They're going to be better to each other. I think that when we look at education, what we've done is we've gotten lazy in K through 12. And I'm not saying we're not putting a bunch of money in it, but we've gotten lazy. And so as a consequence, we really have graduation rates that are more like what we ought to see in Afghanistan than what we ought to see, you know, in a country as developed as the United States. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, but part of it is I think we've gotten lazy in terms of accountability for that, and who's accountable for that, and families accountable for that, and communities accountable for that. So I think that's part of it, and we're a little scared of standards. Now, I'm not going to get in the argument about standardized testing, but I'm going to say when you do something, there ought to be certain accountability for what you can do at the end of it. Otherwise, there's no transferability, there's no bona fides associated with. If I get a high school graduate or a university graduate or someone out of a program, if I can't make an assumption about certain things that they can do, then it means I got to test everybody for everything. There's no point in having accreditation on things like that. So I think it's really critical that we look at it. And of course, the great problem with education is it's not something you can solve tomorrow.
Right.
You build a problem, but you really can't solve it. It takes a bunch of years to solve it. Because the statistics I read, if at third grade a child is behind on reading, statistically they don't catch up. So you don't do an intervention in junior or high school and suddenly, you know, get them up. You can help, but if they fall behind early, statistically it just doesn't happen.
Exactly. Those gap years are tough too.
Yeah.
So as you think, because I know you do a lot of work on national service as well. So if we tie the connection of, you know, K-12 not working, the need for national service, talk about your views on national service, because obviously that is, and I guess specifically, what are the, you know, what will the benefit of that being for our country, and what are the obstacles you see in implementing such a large initiative at scale?
Sure. I was not involved in this at all until after I'd retired. I had never thought about it. I was, you know, you stay in your pretty narrow field like I had in the military. But I reached the conclusion that, one, we needed a military draft, and I still have that conclusion, not because we need more soldiers, because we got plenty of soldiers, not because we need better soldiers, because we get great people, but we need all America represented. When America makes the decision to go to war, every zip code should be represented so that the American people have an equal buy-in to it. It's a big decision to do that. Having a narrow professional force that will go to war is a really dangerous thing. One, because it might lower the threshold to go to war because I'm going to send someone else's kid to war. And the other thing is the military can drift away. You know, you can drift away from your connection to the population. When I would travel around when I was senior in Iraq and Afghanistan to little bases, every time I landed at a little base, the company commander, platoon leader, platoon sergeant, or somebody was the son or daughter of one of my peers. Every time. And it was kind of like old home week because you knew them when they were 5 years old. You know, they went first grade with your son and whatnot. But then you go, wait a minute, that's really not a good thing because we don't want an insular force. So that was part of it. And so my sense of the gap, but then I looked at one of the things that bothers me about America is our sense of citizenship, I think, has shrunken. And what I mean by that is A nation is nothing more than a decision by a group of people to be a nation. You know, God didn't draw boundaries and say, this is America. People got together and said, this is America. And it's a covenant between people that says, we'll do certain things. We will, for the common defense, for common welfare, etc., we'll give certain things, and from that we get certain things. We get certain protections and rights within that and whatnot. Well, if you start to think of citizenship as something, it's a card you get, or it's something you grow up with, or it's a set of entitlements. I get to be an American, therefore I get this, this, and this, and kind of all I have to do is pay my taxes and vote, and only about a third of us vote, then suddenly I don't think our vision of citizenship is what I think it ought to be. I think citizenship, this covenant between people, is responsibility for other citizens. It's responsibility between each of us here, and it's responsibility for Americans we've never even met. And so how do you build that? Well, you know, you have civics class and you say, gotta love all Americans. All right. I really think you do that from experience. You know, think of those things that you feel differently about and strongly about. Typically, they come from experience. If anybody here has ever gone and worked on something that helps other people, either in a case of poverty or education or whatever, you come away different from the experience. You view it differently. You suddenly you're in a position, if you're immersed long enough, to be a very different degree of empathy for the people in that particular situation, because from afar it's easy to go, they're either lazy or they're stupid, or, you know, they just don't get it. And then when you're in that situation close enough to for a while, you go, no, wait a minute, there's a lot more to this than I realized. Every time I served overseas in the military in places like that, I left with a conclusion that, you know, I had come in with this very narrow view, and I left with a wider view, not complete, but wider. And I think that's what Americans need. And I think we need to get out, and we need to be a part of something that's bigger than ourselves, and I think we need to do it for a year. So the premise of the Franklin Project is every young American does 1 year of paid national service. Now, it has to be paid, because otherwise you're just going to have rich kids whose parents can support them. So you got to have everybody do it. But it would be in education, healthcare, conservation, you name it, something that links with other people, something that has value, so at the end of it you feel like I did something of value. Maybe you work in an elementary school classroom for a year, maybe you work in a rest home for older people, you know, you name it. And at the end of that year, you will have done good work, but the real value is what comes in you. It is the experience you take away. It's the real product of this is the alumni. Because statistically, if you do something like that, you vote at 3 times the rate of people who don't. You volunteer at a higher rate for the rest of your life. You have a different view of society. And I just think America would be better served if every young person had the opportunity to do that. And then you say, okay, here's an old guy telling young people it's time to serve. But the reality is the demand has already been demonstrated. There are 80,000 slots in AmeriCorps, 40,000 full-time, 40,000 part-time. That's all that are funded. There were 580,000 applications for those 80,000 slots. There are 10 times as many applications for Teach for America as there are slots. 10 times as many for the Peace Corps as there are slots. So the demand has been signaled. Mm-hmm. And if we can just create the opportunities, now part of it's funding, part of it's we've got to create, I mean, you can't put people on make-work things that don't have value, or it'll just be a negative experience. But all those things we can do. So what we're doing is we built a coalition. Many people have been in this space for many years, and we're trying to get new energy into it. We're trying to also leverage this political campaign, because this is a completely centrist issue. This is nonpartisan. Yeah. We're trying to get candidates from both sides to say we disagree on everything, but we agree on this. Of course.
What do you see the biggest obstacles? Because obviously that is such a massive project.
Yeah, it's inertia. America, in my view, is sort of like a deer with its caught in the headlights. America, for some reason, thinks it can't do anything big anymore. Think of the big things that we did in our history. Take the Erie Canal, take the Panama Canal, take the Boulder Dam, you name it. I read a book about the Boulder Dam not too long ago, and it's a great story. I trained as an engineer, very interested in this, and at the end of the book, I'm all motivated about this, and then he goes, we could never build it now because we couldn't get the 7 states to agree. We couldn't get EPA approval. We couldn't do this. We would look at the problem and we would go, it's just too hard. And I think that applies to a lot of things in America right now. I think we get sort of stunned by the big challenge. And so we do these incremental things at the edges and we convince ourselves that gestures are enough to solve the problem, and they're not. So every once in a while, I think we got to look at something big and we are capable of doing anything, but we are right now incapable of leveraging our potential.
Go big or go home. I hear you. So listen, I've been yapping and I could talk to your ears off for hours.
Thank
I
you,
can
Scott.
tell you that. I would love to open it up to some audience participation because I think it'd be more fun to chat with you guys versus hearing from me. So, Tom, you want to pass the mic around for some questions? Any questions from the audience? I do have something. While you pass the mic, I got someone from our live stream. I always start with that. It's from Angela. How do you motivate your group when their motivation has dwindled?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things. One, you got to figure out why their motivation has dwindled. You know, people will lose their motivation when they think what you're doing isn't being done correctly. They'll lose their motivation when they think you're not committed. At the height of the war, congressmen used to come to me, and I've got this special operations task force, and most of the guys had been at war. By the time I commanded for 5 years, most of them had been at war for 7 straight years, and yet they're still going out every night. And this isn't 18-year-old kids who think they're bulletproof. This is 35 and 40-year-old guys who are going out, who've got kids in college or high school. They've got wives they've been married to for 20 years. They know they got everything to lose, but they're still doing it. And my answer to them, I said, as long as they believe we're serious, as long as they believe there's an objective to this that we will prosecute, then they'll stay committed. As soon as they think we're not, they'll stop. And I think that happens to organizations. I think for a leader, one of the first things you got to do is convince people of the importance of what you're doing. If you can't make that case, then you better go back and take a look at what you're doing and why you're doing it. The second is you got to convince people of your commitment to it. And that can be hard. You know, when I was commanding my last year in service, I'm commanding in Afghanistan, and I got a lot of doubts. You know, people send me over there and they say, this is what we want you to do. Okay, got it. And then people would say, well, can you do it? And I'd go, yeah, we can do it. And some people, either press or whatever, would go, well, that's unrealistic. This guy doesn't get it. And I'd go, of course I get it. But you got 150,000 soldiers working for you. And the last thing they want to do is see their leader go up and go, when someone asks, can you do it? And go, I don't know. You know, give me a break.
Right.
You know,
Right.
So leaders have got to be committed and enthusiastic. And if they're not, everybody will, of course, lose heart.
Oh, great question. So now let's move to an audience question. If you could introduce yourself first, that would be great.
Awesome. I love talking about myself. Hi, I'm Zach Hill. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer of an organization called the Future Project. And like you, I'm really passionate about national service. And I have a really simple question, I think, which is, you know, okay, we could build Boulder Dam 50, 75, 100 years ago with the canals and such, and we can't now. What changed, and how do we get it back?
Yeah. I think what changed is we have allowed ourselves to be treated by chihuahuas. And what I mean is we've allowed our political system to be attacked by special interests from all angles. And so people can hamstring it in every way, and we've allowed that to happen. And we haven't allowed ourselves the ability to make the big decision without being caught up in that. And I think we seem hesitant to make the case to the American people for the big idea. You know, there are times when it's pushed upon us. You know, the Great Depression wasn't something we looked for, but obviously to work our way out of it was pretty obvious we had to do it. Big wars do that. But in every other case, I think we back off making the case to the American people. I would argue that after 9/11, we had a very complex problem, but we really didn't make the case to the American people for what we were going to try to do about it. And it kind of didn't matter what we were going to do, but we had this moment in which we could have united the American people in a lot of things. I think we could have gotten national service done. I think we could have fixed education in that moment. But we sort of said, no, we don't want to ask too much. And I don't think asking too much is a sin, at least to the American people.
Interesting. How about you up front next?
Oh, I thought you were going to do something
Yeah, I don't have an audience one yet, so I will move to another, an online one, so I'll move to a audience one.
Hi, is this thing on?
It's on. You sound great.
Hi, I'm Sloan Trugman. Thank you so much, Tashkar, for what you do. I met you back at Geo in June. So it's not so much a comment or question as it is comment. You had spoken back, I know this is a different discussion, on asymmetrical leadership and communication styles. So how do you take what you've spoken there and apply it into this discussion on companies? How to re-inject culture with operations and new standards? Because there has to be readiness in that. So how do you take risk leaders and turn them into inspirational cultural drivers?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And inside organizations, leaders tend to model the culture of the organization because it's safe. You do what other leaders in the organization do by habit or whatever. Sometimes it's all you know, sometimes it's the norm, and it's the safe thing to do. And in many cases in organizations, what happens is if you follow the rules, even if the outcome is not great, you're pretty safe. Because I followed the right rules, I did this, and in fact it came out okay, kind of not my fault. And so what happens is to become an iconoclastic leader is high risk, because two things have to happen. We have books about iconoclastic leaders who succeeded. They knocked down walls, they did this, the company made a lot more money or something, and they became icons. There's a pantheon of people who are iconoclastic who did it and it didn't work. And unfortunately, we've got to sort of celebrate all those, even the ones, because a certain percentage aren't going to work. So I guess what I'd say is inside an organization, you have to create an environment in which that kind of leadership is accepted, which means you've got to be able to tell people what risk is allowed, which means because of risk, there's going to be failure. And when I first took over the Special Operations Task Force, the organization was physically absolutely courageous, but they were risk averse to mission failure. And so what they would do is they wouldn't do a mission unless they had really good intelligence and they had all the stuff lined up. And I asked them, which means you can't do very many missions because you got to do all this stuff. And I'd ask them, why are you doing this? They said, well, we got to do so-and-so, and we don't want to, basically, we want to have a high batting average. And I said, our batting average doesn't matter. Our effect on the battlefield matters. So I'm okay if you try hard. Don't be, cavalier with the lives of your people, but don't worry about failure. Worry about how much cumulative effect we have on the enemy's success, which means that every time they fail, you got to sort of celebrate it. And you got to tell people that's okay. Now, that's got to be separated from people who fail because they are acting incorrectly, dishonest, negligent, or whatever. And you got to act on that. You got to do what you always do with that. But people who are, taking a swing at a pitch or whatever, whatever analogy you want to do, you have to allow that. In fact, you have to do it. That's one of the great strengths of entrepreneurship in America. The fact that people can go bankrupt and try again actually is something that has sort of primed the pump of that part of the American economy. Thank you.
Great. We got a question online, and I like this one. Have you ever seen people greatly improve their emotional intelligence with concerted effort?
Yeah.
That's hard.
Because you're asking if you think emotional intelligence is a natural gift or
Yes.
not, then I don't know if they improve it. I think they execute it better.
Yes.
I have been in organizations where the culture was one of cynicism or sarcasm or in the military, and probably see it in civilian companies as well. I've seen cases where you have a senior general and they have a difficult personality, kind of an acerbic personality, and their whole staff around them are the same kind of jerks. It literally, when the boss is there, he's doing this, and you turn around and they're all going, and you just want to vomit. And you think, well, maybe this guy went and he looked and found like personalities and gathered them around him. I don't think that's what happens. I think young people start to exhibit the behaviors that they think are acceptable. And when I was a young officer, it was right after the Vietnam War, and one of the habits in the U.S. was profanity over the radio. You'd be over an unsecure FM radio, and somebody up your chain wouldn't like what you're doing, and they would scream over the radio, things that would curl your hair. And you go, wow, And a lot of people are hearing it because it was a big net. But that was considered a macho, decisive kind of leadership. You know, I'm going to boom, boom, boom. And that was just considered okay. And everybody picks it up. And I think you start to see that become infectious. So I think I've also seen organizations where leaders come in and they're calm and they've got empathy and they've got a sense of consideration for other people. And the same thing happens. Suddenly everybody starts exhibiting that. So particularly with young people, you learn from watching, you learn from interaction with people. And so I'm not sure you change their EQ, but you certainly change their behavior.
That's right, makes sense. So let's take a question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Chrissy Ferrier. I have a startup that launched in February, and my question is about paradigm shift. So moving from investment banking industry to the startup entrepreneurial world, there's a lot of things that you have to leave behind. And I think the transparency that you mentioned earlier is one of them in empowering teams. So things that I'm having to do now so that we can be fast and be agile, fail quickly, and move on would never have been possible before. But my question is about managing the downside of especially transparency and empowering your teams. And is there any way to kind of, I don't know, control or prepare for the potential bad things that could come out of that?
Yeah, and that's a great point, because you know, when you go to the levels of transparency that either a startup or an organization in the kind of situation we found ourselves in, you've sort of sped the car up with, you know, the chance you can run off the rails pretty easily. WikiLeaks was a case. They're sharing more information than a young soldier makes a decision to leak a bunch of information. That's a danger. There's also the danger that people take information out of context. They hear things, and somebody's only got part of it. They either act poorly on that, or they start spreading, you know, rumors and things like that. So it's really possible for the organization to misuse the permissions they've been given. And what happens is, in some organizations, as soon as that happens, you start walking back. The first time somebody, you know, takes a business trip and doesn't do expenses correctly, then someone says, we got to get a system to control that. And you start to put a system in. And then pretty soon you got this bureaucracy that's just ungodly, and it takes, you know, all this overhead. So you start to put controls and all in place. And the challenge is hitting that sweet spot. The challenge is creating a place where there's enough flexibility for people to operate, but still the expectation of accountability. If you're dealing with a very small group who are very mature, you know, the rules can be pretty lax because everybody knows it. But if you're successful, it's going to get bigger. And as it gets bigger, people who join weren't there at the founding, don't know the original, you know, concept of the organization, even though you try to communicate to them. It just gets further from that point. It gets harder and harder to maintain that. And so you got to get that careful balance between giving people enough guidance, giving them enough guide rails so they don't get out of control, and at the same time allowing them to operate effectively. And that's sort of the art. And as you get bigger, it gets harder and harder. And that's why I'm a great believer in the idea of team of teams. You can't just be one big team, because you can't control beyond about 100 people. So you've got to be in segmented teams, but at the same time, within those teams, you've got to have connections to the other teams to be effective. Is that fair? Thank you.
Scaling teams, nothing
Exactly.
harder. So we got another great one online. We're switching gears a little bit, but how do we think the American people should approach the challenge of welcoming their fellow citizens back from war?
Yeah. This is a tough one, and most of the veterans in the room will probably have some version of this. It's a little uncomfortable when people come to you and they thank you for your service or whatever, because one, you volunteered for it, and it's nice to be thanked, but at the same time, there's always a slight feeling that maybe you either don't deserve it or maybe they just feel guilty, or, you know, there's a lot of things that go with that.
Right.
I think the first thing the American people ought to do is, it shouldn't be a superficial thank you. It shouldn't be head of the line at the airport. What it really means is, if you go into the military, when you were in the Coast Guard, you went from a town or a city or a neighborhood, you went. You know, they sent you. You may have raised your hand, but you're a product of that. And when you come home, that's who owns you.
Yes.
you know, it's not the big bureaucracy of the federal government, it's your neighborhood and whatnot. If you decide to go back there, there should be a sense of responsibility for you as you come back. Mm-hmm. And I think that sense of responsibility doesn't mean you get everything you want, you know, that sort of thing. But it means a certain responsibility that you took a period out while your peers continued on, they got jobs, they built lives, etc. So you're coming back in later, and you may need opportunity to come back in. And I think it's really got to be done at a pretty local level. And I'm not sure
That makes a lot of sense. No, it's got to be local. So what about a question from the audience? Who's got a microphone? Back there.
Yes, sir. Super excited for the book. I was just wondering, as we learn from you in the book, who have you been learning from? Who are your role models, and who else should we be reading?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of good books out there that have different parts of it. I had dinner the other night with a guy named Dan Levitin, and he wrote The Organized Mind. And I like to learn about things that are different from what I know. He really looks at how the mind deals with information, because we're in an age now where we take in so much more information than we did before, and your mind has a real challenge dealing with that. And if you think of an organization as a collection of minds, how does an organization deal with information? I think looking at that kind of thing, and that's the kind of book that I enjoy reading, because we are facing fundamentally different challenges than we did even 20 years ago for management and leadership, because things are so much more complex, there's so much more information, it's going so much faster that not only do we need different techniques, we need to try to get a different way to get our mind around it. So that's the kind of thing. Otherwise, leaders in America, you can see, are struggling now because, you know, iconic leaders don't last long, because any iconic leader becomes vulnerable to, you know, it's kind of like Wild Bill Hickok. Every kid who wants to make a name for himself shows up. And there's not a lot of responsibility in people who will take shots at them. So what we've done is we've created an environment for leaders who are very vulnerable, and they don't like it. And so I think it causes a lot of leaders to not take the responsibility for on the wider public stage that we need them to. And I can't say I blame them a bit, but it's we got to stop shooting our leaders as they grow or when they're at senior levels.
Excellent. So we have a question online from Nolan. You talk a lot about fostering the right environment for success. What would you define as the core tenets needed to change an environment for the positive?
Yeah. I think the first thing is you're really trying to get four things. You're trying to get this idea of trust and common purpose across an organization, so everybody has a common sense of what you're about. The common purpose is really an identity and what you're doing, and then trust within each other. And of course, people talk a lot about trust. It lowers transaction costs. It creates greater engagement for people. Everybody wants to be in an environment of trust. And then as the organization gets bigger, I'm a great believer in this concept of shared consciousness, and that is sharing and understanding and contextual understanding of what's happening. If you ever think about it, if you're ever in an organization where you're in a cubicle in an office and, you know, the great people go in a room and they work and then they come out and they don't tell you what's going on, and, you know, you're kind of doing your thing, you're much less committed to the outcome than if they bring you in and say, okay, here's the problem, here's what we're trying to do, and whatnot. So I think shared consciousness is what we were trying to do in our big video teleconference, was respect people enough to show them. Of course, you not only get more engagement, you also get a lot of good ideas. And then the idea of empowered execution, and that's pushing decision-making down. And that's not because you want to be nice to people lower down the chain of command. It's not because you're just a good egalitarian person. It's because that's the only thing that'll work now. You just cannot centralize information. Hierarchies requiring information to go through levels of the chain to make a decision and go back down just cannot be fast enough. And they can't be close enough and therefore be dialed in enough for things to be effective. And that's
that makes sense. So another in the audience. Who has this?
Hi, I have a mic.
There we go.
Hello, my name is Radha. I produced a film with Zach Iscol, who I believe you know, about the Iraq War. And first of all, I'm inspired by your leadership, and so thank you for all you do. But my question really is around ISIS. What do you think of ISIS, and how do you think that the Americans, and how are we handling it?
Yeah, no, I don't, I'm certainly not going to come, say that we're handling it real well right now. But I'm not one of these people who says, I'm the only person with a perfect idea how to do this, because it's a hairy problem. What I will tell you about ISIS, if you think of Al-Qaeda as the original, almost a legacy kind of terrorist group, then think Al-Qaeda in Iraq as 2.0, think of ISIS as 3.0. They are the growth and they are the maturation of the idea. They've got the same idea of create a caliphate and do all of these things, but they have developed new techniques and wider capabilities than their predecessors did. They only exist, in my opinion, because what has happened is the Mideast is literally fallen apart. The analogy I like to use is a patient with HIV/AIDS. And many of you would know that nobody ever died from HIV/AIDS. They died from some stupid little disease that suddenly was lethal when their immune system was gone. And that's why it was so hard to figure out what was happening there, because people are dying of these strange little diseases, and then they realized it was the immune system that had been compromised. Well, the immune system for the entire Mideast region has been compromised for lots of reasons, one of which has been poor governance on the part of a number of those countries, one of which has been violence that has happened. There are a lot of reasons that has happened, and we probably didn't help. But the reality is it's sort of collapsing. And so you suddenly, in the chaos, organizations do well who are most focused. Go back to the Russian Revolution. People say the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar. No, they didn't. The Russian people overthrew the Tsar, and the Bolsheviks overthrew the revolution because they were the most committed, narrow special interest in a time of chaos. ISIS is sort of that. They are the most committed. And if you think about ISIS, they really don't have a very powerful recruiting tool. I mean, they're very, very extreme. Not many people in the region are that religiously fundamental. Their behavior is abhorrent, and to most of the people in the region. But at the same time, what do they offer? They offer this idea of we'll get stuff done. We don't mess around. For a region that's been frustrated and uses the term humiliation and gets pushed around, suddenly you got somebody who says, we are not screwing around anymore. It's kind of like the Magnificent Seven showing up. We're going to kill everybody around that's your bad, that's your enemies. And to a degree, to part of the population, even who don't like them, they go, well, I do have a grudging admiration for people who don't, mess around. They don't mealy-mouth around. And that's why they do these horrific things and film them, because they're trying to show everybody we don't mess around. It scares us, but it inspires a group of people. And then you say, well, okay, well, I see this. If I'm in the region, I'm a young person, I see this, and I'm really turned off by it. And you say, well, join the good side. And then they turn around and say, well, who's the good side? And there's really not a compelling counter-narrative. If you're not going to support ISIS, who are you going to support if you're a Sunni? You're going to support a kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Are you going to support an autocratic dictatorship? Are you going to? Those are all kind of yesterday's forms of government that haven't been real inclusive. So your options, there's not something to be for that's really, attractive. Now, I think what we got to do is we got to admit that this is a structural and political problem long term. You're going to have to solve that. You can bomb ISIS all you want. That's not going to solve the problem. It'll make us feel good, but it won't solve the problem. And so you have got to you got to get a political solution in Syria. You've got to make a decision on, and that's going to have to be partially a political solution. I mean, there's got to be a framework. Otherwise, the country will splinter into 1,000 pieces. And people like the Alawites under Bashar al-Assad, they got nowhere to go. And they feel like they'll be massacred by the Sunnis. So, I mean, they're going to fight forever. So you got to have to create something that people believe is at least attractive enough to be acceptable. And it's not going to be pretty, but it's going to have to be acceptable. And we can't do it ourselves. We can't impose it, but we're going to have to help. And that big political solution is going to have to be then reinforced by a coalition of outside elements, because there's just not enough strength inside the region to do it. I think it's 30 years of work, though.
Yeah.
It's not 3.
We'll take another question from the audience.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jenna, and I work at Edelman in the Insights and Intelligence Division. On top of everything that you've done in your career, you've done something that's amazingly hard for a lot of people, and that's successfully make the transition from military to civilian life. I've done it myself. I'm a veteran, and it was extreme luck being in the right place at the right time. You've talked about the Franklin Project. How do you tackle the opposite side of that problem and integrate soldiers and airmen back into civilian life and get them in the business sector?
Yeah, I think one, we start with the fact that the military doesn't do a very good job. And you got to think why they don't do a good job. It's because, one, they don't think much about it. When you're in a military unit, you're thinking about your unit and the people. And when someone's leaving or left, I mean, they're good people and you love them, but you don't have any responsibility or interest in them, so you wish them well and they're gone. And so we don't have any accountability for the military on the effectiveness of people getting jobs when they get out. And so there's just no real focus on it. Even though Defense Department pays the unemployment insurance, $800 million a year for soldiers on unemployment, ex-soldiers on unemployment. So I mean, economically there should be, they just don't. We don't allow employers on base. What we ought to be doing is military bases and all, when you're 6 months before you get out of the service, you ought to already have a job. Companies ought to be allowed to come on and recruit and do all this kind of stuff, and you ought to already have a job, and the military has to come halfway on that. The other part is civilian companies need to make it a real effort. I'm on JP Morgan's Veterans Advisory Board, and I joined it 4 years ago. They came and asked me if I'd be on it, and I said, if you're serious. And they said, we're serious. And I said, all right. And they have been. They have full-time staff works to run this, to take all the information in, to hire people, to constantly research the problem. Why is there turnover among certain parts of the veterans and all like that? Because it takes that level of effort to do this. They get great employees from it, but it takes that level. And so I'm a great believer that organizations have got to take a greater level of accountability to do that. Thank you.
In general, I'll add one thing that I'm passionate about is also reform in the GI Bill. Is that, you know, we have veterans that are crowdsourcing their education with our company. We have veterans that are sleeping in their cars to take our courses with the whole job of getting a job, and the more we can do that as well.
It's got to be a lot more flexible.
Exactly. Thank you for saying that, because that's what we believe in. So we actually have time for one more question. It's been a fantastic evening. Anyone want to do the last question? Here we go.
Hi, I'm Steve. I'm a co-founder of a company called Leadonomics. This is a question that I've heard before, and I think you would have a good response to. As a leader leading an organization, what is the best context you can create for amazing, magical things to happen?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's an idea of shared opportunity. You know, if you want things to happen, you're going to have to open it up so people can make things happen. You know, if you're waiting for one leader to do it, it might happen. You might have this amazing leader who says we're going to go this way and we're going to make this decision. It might work out and everybody is along for the ride. But that's a long shot. You're required to have that kind of person. One of the things I learned when I was in JSOC, I took over in the fall of 2003, and I had no idea how the organization had to change. All I knew was that the status quo, we were losing the war, and so therefore the status quo was unacceptable. And so I spent my time initially telling the organization, we cannot stay where we are because we're losing. We're going to have to change. I think we got to go in this direction, but you're going to have to figure it out, you, the organization. And you're going to have to learn, and we're going to have to change and whatnot together. Because I could never have drawn a straight line to where we ended up. I couldn't have even gotten close. But I was able to at least make that initial case, and then it became self-reinforcing, and the organization did it. I think that's the way organizations are going to do best. And people, I believe, respond very well to the opportunity to be part of the solution as opposed to just working on it. Fair? Thank you.
Well, listen, you know, what an awesome evening. It's been amazing. Your insights have been fantastic, and thank you. And everyone, please join me in giving a massive round of applause for one of the country's greatest leaders. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.